There was a legend that spoke of a demon king who once asked a mage what drove mages to go to such lengths. The mage answered that there was something she wanted and needed to protect. With that mindset, her power flowed without limits. She would fight the demon king and protect everyone. The demon king was eventually destroyed after being struck by the mage's holy lightning, and their battle came to an end. Fajiti was a city located in the southern region of the Alzano Kingdom. This city was born and developed alongside the Alzano Imperial Magic Academy. That day, Rumia saw a man who had hurt his finger while trying to light a fire. She approached him and healed the wound using her magic. The Alzano Kingdom was known as the center of magical power because the Alzano Imperial Magic Academy had been standing for over 400 years. Thanks to Rumia's spell, the man's injury healed completely. He guessed that Rumia must have been a student at the academy and praised her for her skills. Rumia told him that, in reality, using magic outside the academy was forbidden, and she asked him to keep it a secret. The man thanked her just as Sistine came over. Rumia then said goodbye to the man before continuing on with Sistine. The academy was not only proud of its long history, but was also a center for advanced magical studies, praised as one of the most prestigious schools. Many well-known mages were alumni of the academy. As Rumia and Sistine walked to school, Sistine wondered why Rumia had not gone on ahead as she had asked. Rumia explained that she could not leave the daughter of the house she was staying in by herself. Sistine told her not to say things like that, even as a joke, because she already thought of Rumia as family. Rumia apologized. Rumia then mentioned that it was unusual for Sistine to forget something. Perhaps it was because of that matter. Their teacher, Mr. Huey, had suddenly retired, and today they would have a substitute teacher. Sistine hoped the substitute would be like Mr. Huey. As they were walking, a man suddenly came running toward them. Sistine quickly used her magic to throw him into the air, and he landed in a nearby fountain. Rumia quietly asked Sistine if she might have gone too far, and Sistine admitted that she had. They went over to the man, who was now soaking wet but thankfully unharmed. The man asked if they were all right and warned them to be careful since cutting across like that could be dangerous. Sistine was confused because it was the man who had been charging toward them, but Rumia pointed out that Sistine had attacked with magic without warning and suggested they apologize. Instead, the man became even more smug, insisting it was their fault. He then placed a hand on Rumia's shoulder, saying she looked familiar. Seeing his lack of manners, Sistine once again used her magic to send him flying into the air, annoyed that he had touched a girl so casually. Meanwhile, Harley expressed his doubts about the new substitute teacher to Rick, the head of the academy. Rick explained that the substitute had been personally recommended by Professor Celica. In Rumia and Sistine's class, all the students were waiting for the new teacher. More than half the class period had passed, yet the teacher still had not arrived. Rumia began to worry that something might have happened, while Wendy noted that it was rare for an academy teacher to be late. Before long, the substitute finally arrived. Sistine immediately called him out for being late. Both she and Rumia were stunned to see that it was the same man from that morning. He introduced himself as the substitute teacher and the one in charge of their class. His name was Glenn. He explained that he would be teaching them for the next month and started to share details about his skills and hobbies, but Sistine cut him off and told him to skip the self-introduction and get straight to the lesson. At that time, Rick mentioned that it shouldn't be a problem if the substitute teacher came recommended by the professor. He also pointed out that the teacher's magic capacity and skills were nothing special. If classified, he would only be a level 3 mage. Holly was surprised, wondering why a level 3 mage would be teaching at this academy when even the lowest-ranked instructors were at least level 4, with many being level 5 or 6. Hallie questioned whether this substitute could really teach the academy's gifted students, saying he might just have them study on their own while he relaxed and had tea. Later in class, Glenn wrote the words self-study on the blackboard and told the students to study on their own that day because he planned to take a nap. The students were baffled, and Sistine immediately grew irritated, throwing a book at him. Around that time, Rick explained to Hallie that the substitute didn't have an official teaching license. Still, for Rick, the professor's recommendation was what mattered most. Rick explained that the substitute was once a prodigy, accepted into the academy at age 11, leaving at 15, but his activities for the next 4 years were unknown. Hearing this, Hallie concluded that the substitute had been wasting his time and was an unreliable mage. Hallie even asked Rick, as the head of the academy, if he truly trusted that so-called old witch. Unexpectedly, Celica stepped in, telling Hallie to watch his words. Hallie was startled to see her there and asked how long she had been listening. Celica said she didn't care if Hallie spoke poorly about her, but she wouldn't forgive anyone who insulted the substitute in front of her. She commanded that Hallie take back his words. Seeing her stern stance, Hallie left the headmaster's office. Celica apologized to Rick, and Rick admitted Hallie's reaction wasn't surprising. After all, the academy had just hired a mage without teaching experience. Celica said she would take responsibility for whatever the Academy achieved under these circumstances. Rick was curious why she was going so far and asked what Glenn meant to her. Celica replied there was nothing special between them. She simply wanted Glenn to live his life to the fullest. When Glenn began teaching, he wrote on the board in such poor handwriting that it was impossible to read. The students commented that they had never seen anyone look so unmotivated before. Wendy was baffled at how unserious he was, especially after getting smacked by Sistine earlier. His teaching style was confusing, and his eyes looked completely lifeless. Lynn then asked Glenn a question about a rune alphabet spell he had just explained, saying she didn't understand how to translate it into everyday language. Glenn casually said he didn't know either and told her to figure it out herself. Annoyed, Sistine asked if that was really an appropriate teacher's response. Glenn simply replied that he didn't know, and when Sistine told him to find the answer and explain it in the next class, he argued it would be faster for her to look it up on her own. Rubia had to calm Sistine down, and Glenn asked whether anyone had ever taught them how to use a dictionary. The bell rang and Glenn ended the lesson, making Sistine even more frustrated. Yeeple even muttered that Glenn was an irresponsible teacher. After that, the girls in Sistine's class began changing clothes for their upcoming alchemy practice, with Glenn assigned as the supervisor. Sistine, still irritated, jokingly teased Rumia about her figure, making lighthearted comments about how it seemed different from her own. Rubia told her to knock it off, but Sistine kept going with her playful remarks. Suddenly, Glenn barged in, kicking the door open, and questioned why they even needed to change clothes for alchemy practice. When he saw the girls were mid-change, he quickly covered his eyes and awkwardly asked why people always panicked and made a big deal over these situations. His clumsy attempt at humor only annoyed the girls further, and Sistine promptly shoved him right back out of the room. During lunch break, Sistine was feeling annoyed because the planned alchemy practice ended up being cancelled, even though she had been eager to study seriously. Rudia came over carrying lunch, fully understanding how dedicated Sistine was to her studies, but suggesting she should eat first. At that moment, Sistine was still thinking about the promise she had made to her grandfather to uncover the mystery of the Melgalia Sky Castle, and how she needed to master a lot of magic in order to achieve it. Suddenly, Glenn showed up at their table to eat. Seeing how much food he had, Rubia asked if he liked eating that much. Glenn admitted that eating was one of his favorite things. Rubia laughed, commenting that the stir-fry he was eating looked delicious. Glenn mentioned that it was the season for Killua beans. He offered some to Rubia, and after taking a bite, she admitted it really was tasty. Glenn then pointed out that Sistine's portion seemed too small to be filling. Sistine shot back that he had no right to comment on her food, and that her smaller portions wouldn't make her sleepy during lessons, but if Glenn's lessons came afterward, she wouldn't mind eating more. Glenn said she was overcomplicating things and told her to just say what she meant. When she was about to speak, Glenn suddenly popped a spoonful of Killua bean stir-fry into her mouth. Sistine was clearly irritated, but Glenn didn't pay it any mind. Meanwhile, Celica still had Glenn on her mind. She had previously offered him the position of substitute teacher. Glenn told her it was impossible because he wasn't fit to teach anyone. Celica responded that he didn't have the right to refuse, even joking that she would threaten him with lightning, fire, or ice if she had to. Glenn begged her to let him off, saying he didn't want to work. Celica immediately launched a magical attack his way. Luckily, it missed, but after that, Glenn couldn't avoid the job anymore. That afternoon, Glenn was back teaching Sistine's class. But for the 3 full periods, he only told the students to study on their own. Unable to hold back her frustration any longer, Sistine stood up and introduced herself as a noble daughter from the prestigious Phoebale family of mages, a name of significant influence at the academy. She even said she would report Glenn to her father to have him fired, though she wouldn't do that if he acted like a real teacher. Unexpectedly, Glenn told her to go ahead and tell her father, saying he was looking forward to it. He even seemed happy about the idea of getting fired soon. In response, Sistine threw her glove in Glenn's face, signaling a formal challenge to a magic duel. Glenn asked if she was serious. At that moment, Rumia stepped in to stop her, asking Sistine to apologize to Glenn and take back her glove. Glenn then asked what Sistine really wanted. She said she only wanted him to change his attitude and start teaching seriously. Glenn countered by saying that if he won, Sistine would have to agree to his request. Cash was surprised by Glenn's attitude, while Cecil thought he looked like he was plotting something a bit harsh. Coming from the Phoebale noble family, Sistine couldn't stand someone like Glenn who disrespected magic. Glenn was surprised that anyone still followed the old tradition of throwing down a glove to challenge someone, but he accepted. The rest of the class was shocked. No one had ever seen a duel between a student and a teacher before. They quickly headed to the courtyard. Glenn said he wasn't fond of hurting kids and insisted they could only use the shockbolt spell. Sistine didn't mind. Cecil asked Cash who he thought would win, and Cash was certain it would be Glenn. Terasal wondered if Glenn was intentionally making it harder for Sistine by limiting the fight to Shock Bolt, but Giebel wasn't so sure, explaining that Shock Bolt was actually a versatile spell and one of the first defensive spells they learned, using electricity to incapacitate the opponent. The usual incantation was "O Spirit of Thunder, strike with your electric shock and paralyze them." In a real fight, though, the winner was usually decided by who could shorten the incantation and cast faster, meaning Glenn must have been confident in his casting speed, especially since he had been personally recommended by Professor Celica. Glenn told Sistine she could attack from any direction. Sistine refused to back down, thinking to herself that as long as she stayed true to who she was, she would never allow a man like Glenn to roam free. Even if she were humiliated, she would still refuse to give in, because her pride as a mage was on the line. Sistine cast a spell and aimed her magic attack at Glenn. Glenn simply smiled, and the magic struck his body. He collapsed instantly. Startled, Sistine asked if she had broken any rules. Glenn tried to get back on his feet and explained that he had intentionally let her win the first round since the match had 3 rounds in total. In the second round, Glenn attempted to cast his spell, but Sistine was faster. Once again, her magic hit him squarely. Glenn hadn't expected Sistine to be that skilled, so he suggested making it a 5-round match. Trying to trick her, Glenn then went on the offensive, but he was still slower in casting his spell. Her magic struck him yet again. Seeing this, Sistine suspected that Glenn might not be able to cast the Shock Bolt spell in a single phrase. Glenn denied it, saying that shortening an incantation was considered taboo, but that didn't mean he couldn't do it. However, all the students realized that he really couldn't. Sistine declared herself the winner of the duel and told Glenn to act like a proper teacher tomorrow. Glenn claimed he had never promised anything and didn't even know what she was talking about. He acknowledged Sistine's talent, forgave her, and said their duel was a draw. Then, without warning, he made a run for it. That day, Sistine was deeply disappointed in him. That day, Glenn was back teaching Sistine's class, and as usual, he just told the students to study on their own. Sistine was baffled. Even after losing a duel against him, Glenn still acted the same way. She couldn't believe he was ignoring a mage's agreement. Lynn came over to Glenn's desk to ask about something she didn't understand, but Sistine said it was pointless to ask him anything. She believed Glenn didn't even understand the greatness or depth of magic and offered to teach Lynn herself. Seeing this, Glenn asked if Sistine's magic was really that amazing. Sistine explained that magic was a study about the very foundation of the world and the answer to the timeless question of why they and the world existed. She said magic was a way for humans to find a path to a higher level of existence. Glenn then asked what the point was in studying the foundations of the world. Sistine replied that she had already explained it. It was to reach that higher level. Glenn asked what higher level meant. Was it becoming a god? And what real benefits did magic bring to humanity? He gave an example. Medical science could save people from illness, agriculture and architecture could benefit society in countless ways, but magic, in his view, had no real use. Sistine insisted magic wasn't that shallow. It was about searching for the meaning of the world and humanity itself. But Glenn was only baiting her. He suddenly claimed that magic was useful for killing people. The whole class froze in shock. Glenn went on, saying that while swordsmanship might kill 1 person, magic could kill 10, and no other field could match it in that regard. He added that magic was deeply connected to killing, and that it was a worthless field that had advanced by taking lives. He honestly didn't understand how people could spend their whole lives studying something so pointless. Unable to accept that, Sistine slapped him hard, tears welling up in her eyes before she ran out of the classroom. That afternoon, Glenn started reflecting on what was so great about magic. He realized the problem wasn't with magic. It was with his own immaturity. He decided to finish his work for the day, and after that, he knew he'd have to make it up to Celica. If he worked hard enough, he was sure she'd forgive him. While wandering through the academy, Glenn spotted Rumia in a room, drawing a magic circle. He immediately went over. Rumia apologized, saying she just wanted to practice making one. Glenn agreed to supervise. Rumia told him the magic circle wasn't working at all. Glenn explained she was missing Mercury. In his view, students often focused too much on invisible concepts while ignoring what was right in front of them, and that proved they tended to overestimate magic. After pouring Mercury into the circle, he told her to try again using the full 5-word arrangement from the textbook, without abbreviating anything. When Rumia recited the spell, the circle lit up beautifully. It was the first time she had ever seen such a perfect magic circle. Glenn told her that anyone could do it. Seeing how happy she was with her first successful magic circle reminded him of the first one he had ever created. On their way home together, Rumia asked if Glenn actually liked magic, since she'd seen him smiling earlier, but Glenn insisted he hated it. She then asked what he had been doing before becoming a teacher at the academy. Glenn admitted he had just been a shut-in, living off others, and that he had been relying on Celica for a whole year. When Rumia tried to dig deeper, Glenn told her not to ask about his past. Instead, Glenn asked why Rumia and her friends were so obsessed with magic, when in his opinion it didn't deserve such admiration. Rumia explained that she wanted to make magic truly useful for humanity. To do that, she needed to understand it better. He also had a debt to repay to someone. When Glenn asked what she meant, Rumia told him that 3 years ago, she had been exiled from her home. Around the time she started living with Sistine, she was captured by an evil mage and almost lost her life, until a heroic mage appeared and saved her. The hero defeated the evil sorcerers one by one. At that moment, Rumia was terrified. But once she realized that the hero had saved her, she felt a strong desire to lead humanity so it wouldn't fall behind in the study of magic. To do that, she knew she had to deepen her understanding of magic. She believed that was the only way she could truly thank the man who had rescued her. In her heart, she thought of him as the one who brought light when she had been crying alone in the dark. That night, Rumia reminded Glenn to apologize to Sistine. She told him it mattered because Sistine had a deep connection with her late grandfather through her magic, and that bond was important to her. It turned out that Sistine's grandfather had once told her the reason he became a mage was to reach the celestial castle of Melgalius. When she was a child, Sistine had told him that she would become an even greater mage than he was and uncover the secrets of that floating castle. The next day, Glenn apologized to Sistine in front of the whole class. He admitted he had gone too far, and after that, he began the day's lesson. But before starting, he bluntly told the students that they were all fools, which naturally shocked everyone. He explained that after observing how they studied, it was obvious to him that they didn't truly understand magic. The students weren't happy about being called out like that. Hebel, for instance, couldn't believe those words had come from a third-rate mage who supposedly couldn't even recite a single line of the Shockbolt spell. Glenn decided to prove a point. He started with the Shockbolt incantation and called them fools again for not realizing something so simple. He recited the standard 3-line spell and cast it. Hearing this, Teresa dismissed it as unimpressive because he had taken 3 lines to do it, and Wendy smugly claimed they had all mastered it long ago. Glenn pointed out that those with proper control could shorten it to 2 lines, but then he posed a question. What would happen if a 3-line spell was expanded into 4 lines instead? Hebel quickly replied that the spell would fail, and Glenn agreed, but asked if they knew exactly what kind of failure it would be. Wendy confidently said the magic would just go wild. Glenn doubted her supposed mastery of Shockbolt, then demonstrated what he meant, casting a 4-line version, which caused the bolt to curve off course. Everyone was stunned. He went on to explain that making it 5 lines reduced the attack's range, and removing even a single word caused the effect to vanish quickly. Glenn told them that magic was essentially an evolved form of automatic suggestion, and that the runic language used for incantations was the most effective tool for activating it. This language reached into the subconscious mind, allowing one to influence the fundamental principles of the world. Magic, he said, wasn't about studying the principles of the world, it was about exploring the human heart. Seeing the students still doubtful that ordinary words could have such power, Glenn gave an example. He casually called Sistine White Cat, which made her visibly annoyed. Then with a straight face, he told her he had loved her from the first time they met. In an instant, the white cat turned bright red. That, he said, was proof that ordinary words could influence someone's mind. Sistine promptly threw a book at his head in frustration. Glenn explained that magic worked a lot like grammar and sentence structure. Both could shape the subconscious however one wanted. He gave another demonstration, surprising the class when he managed to cast a spell while speaking in a lazy, almost careless tone. The trick, he told them, was to let the subconscious handle the incantation. He then asked what came to their minds when they heard the words white cat. The same principle applied to spells. If they understood the meaning behind them, pronunciation wouldn't be hard. But if they ignored the fundamentals and only memorized what was in the books, then their learning process would be foolish. In his view, they were nothing more than mages who could only parrot incantations. After that, Glenn began teaching them the true basics. Rick acknowledged Glenn's talent in teaching, and Celica wasn't surprised at all since Glenn had always been gifted at guiding other students. Celica even mentioned that Glenn was the best student she had ever taught from the very beginning. Unfortunately, Hallie didn't share that sentiment and was even planning to have Glenn expelled from the academy. Meanwhile, Glenn explained to his students that most of them tended to see both common and unique magic as something impressive, when in fact it wasn't always that great, especially if they skipped over mastering common magic first. Without that foundation, using advanced magic would be pointless. That afternoon, Glenn sat on the school rooftop, lost in thought about Rumia and Sistine. Celica came over and asked if he was spending his youth daydreaming, since lately he seemed a bit more energetic. She teased him, saying that before this, he'd been like a fish dead for a month, but now he was like a fish dead for just a day. Glenn apologized for troubling her. Celica then told him she would be leaving the next day for a magic negotiation. Since Huey would also be away, the class Glenn was teaching would have an extra lesson. She reminded him not to do anything strange with the students while they were gone. Glenn replied that it would never happen, especially since he was used to seeing women like Celica and therefore wouldn't be interested in ordinary girls. Hearing that, Celica suddenly hugged him from behind. Glenn felt uncomfortable and quickly freed himself from her arms. Not long after, Rumia and Sistine showed up to greet them. Rumia wanted to ask something, but Glenn, in his usual smug tone, said that a great teacher like him would be giving advice to his foolish student. Sistine was clearly annoyed by his behavior. Later that night, while Rumia was brushing Sistine's hair, she mentioned that Glenn's explanations were easy to understand. Sistine admitted Glenn was great as a teacher, but terrible as an ordinary person. Rumia suddenly brought up the time when she had first come to Sistine's house and they weren't close yet. Over time, they grew more comfortable with each other, so Rumia was confident that Glenn could eventually get along with Sistine too. Sistine, however, wasn't interested in that idea. That night, Lake, Carol, and Jin discussed a plan that had been delayed because Celica had taken Glenn with her. They decided to proceed with it the next day when the magic negotiations began. The next morning, Glenn ran to school because he was late. When he arrived, he called out for someone to come out, saying he could see through their hiding spot. The person turned out to be Carol, who praised Glenn for spotting him even though he had been using a quick defensive spell. Glenn asked who he was, but Carol refused to give his name, saying that his only goal was to kill him. Carol then immediately attacked Glenn with his magic. Meanwhile, in the classroom, Sistine wondered why Glenn had been so popular lately. Rumia teased her, asking if Glenn's fame was making her feel lonely. Sistine denied it. Suddenly, Jin and Lake entered the class, claiming that their teacher couldn't make it, so they would be substituting. Sistine scolded them, reminding them that outsiders weren't allowed in the school. Without warning, Jin launched a magic attack that nearly hit her. Sistine realized that the magic was military grade. Jin threatened to deal with anyone who resisted and said they were looking for a girl named Rumia. Naturally, no one admitted anything. He then questioned Lin, but she refused to tell him anything. Sistine asked what they wanted with Rumia, which seemed to annoy Jin, and he prepared to attack her. Seeing this, Rumia stepped forward and admitted her identity. Jin said he already knew which girl was Rumia. He had just been toying with the idea of harming innocent people. Lake told Jin to stop fooling around, and then they asked Rumia to come with them. Sistine tried to stop her from going, but Rumia said she believed that Glenn would come to save them. Jin then claimed that he had already killed Glenn, which left both Rumia and Sistine in shock. Left with no choice, Rumia went with them. She asked why they were after her, and Lake explained that Rumia, better known to him as Princess Ermiana, was not supposed to be alive. If she had been allowed to live, there had to be a reason. At that moment, Jin seized Sistine and dragged her into a room with bad intentions. Sistine declared that she was the daughter of the noble female family. Jin admitted that Rumia wasn't his type because she looked fragile, though she had a strong spirit. On the other hand, Sistine might seem strong, but in his eyes, she was just a girl hiding her weakness behind a mask, and he liked girls like that. Sistine firmly stated she wouldn't give in. But when Jadis tore her clothes and tried to get closer, she desperately pleaded with Jin to stop. Jin was surprised that she seemed to give up so quickly. With tears in her eyes, Sistine wished someone would help her. Just as Jin was about to go further, Glenn suddenly swung the door open, casually apologizing for interrupting. Sistine quickly begged him for help. But as Glenn stepped forward, she suddenly urged him to run, warning that Jin's power was far beyond his. Jin hurled a spell at Glenn, but it had no effect, no matter how many times he tried. Glenn explained that magic wouldn't work on him because he was using Arcana card to seal all magic within a certain range around him. It was his own original spell called the Fool's World. Jin was stunned, wondering just how powerful Glenn really was. Even Sistine was shocked. If Glenn could seal magic, it meant he couldn't be beaten by any mage. But Glenn admitted that the spell also affected him, meaning he couldn't use magic either. Jin laughed at the irony, asking how a mage could fight after sealing his own magic. In response, Glenn charged at him and landed a series of barehanded blows, taking him down with ease. Jin was left wondering who Glenn really was and why he could fight like a soldier from the royal army. Glenn introduced himself as a substitute teacher, and Jin realized that meant Glenn had already defeated Carol. He was shocked that a mage would choose to challenge someone using only punches. Glenn then said that if Jin didn't want to lose to a punch, then he should get ready to be defeated by a magical punch, which, in a surprising twist, turned out to be a kick. Glenn managed to take down Jin without using any magic. He knew Sistine must have been terrified after what almost happened to her, so he asked if she was hurt. Sistine assured him she was fine. Glenn thought she might say he wasn't fit to teach anyone since his hands had just been used for violence, but instead she pointed out that his pants had slipped down. Sistine then mentioned there was still one more person who had taken Rumia, and it seemed Glenn would be interrogating Jin later. Not long after, Celica finally managed to contact Glenn after he'd been having trouble reaching her. Glenn explained that the intruders had broken through the protective barrier, isolating the academy, and had taken the students hostage. Celica asked if Glenn knew who the intruders were. Seeing the tattoo on Jin's body, Glenn told her they were members of the Heavenly Gospel, a secret society of dark mages, a notorious terrorist group in the Empire's history. These intruders shouldn't have been able to get past the Academy's magic defenses, which meant someone on the inside was helping them. Glenn asked Celica to investigate any suspicious instructors and request assistance from the Magic Court, but she said she couldn't because she was just a regular teacher without that kind of authority. Glenn urged her to come to the Academy using a magic circle. Celica told him to calm down, explaining that if the barrier had already been destroyed, the teleportation circles were likely the first thing the intruders would have taken out. Still, she promised she'd hurry there and told Glenn not to die. At that moment, Glenn noticed Sistine staring off in thought. She asked if they weren't going to get any help. Then, without warning, she bolted off, determined to rescue Rumia. Glenn stopped her, telling her it would be suicide. Frustrated and in tears, Sistine admitted he was right, that magic felt useless and was now putting Rumia in danger. Glenn told her not to cry. He reminded her that Rumia wanted to make magic something that could help people, and because of that, she wanted to understand it better. For that reason alone, Glenn said he wouldn't let Rumia die. He promised to take down the two enemies that were left. Suddenly, Jin started laughing, saying that Glenn was just an ordinary man like him. Sistine disagreed, saying Glenn was nothing like Jin or the others, but Jin insisted that Glenn was the same kind of scoundrel and killer as he was. Out of nowhere, a portal appeared, bringing in an army of skeletal golems. Jin grinned, thinking his reinforcements had arrived, but the golems immediately turned on him and killed him instead. Sistine froze in shock, and Glenn quickly pulled her back. He punched one of the golems, only to find its bones were incredibly tough. Sistine lent her magic power to help him, and Glenn smashed one of the golems to pieces with a single blow. Glenn then told Sistine they needed to run, but the skeletal army kept chasing them. Glenn decided to hold them off and told Sistine to use the Gale Blow spell, but to make it wider and last longer. Sistine was confused about why it had to be so complicated, and Glenn warned he'd dock her grade if she couldn't do it. Determined, Sistine agreed to try. While Glenn fought off the golems, Sistine chanted her spell. Once it was ready, Glenn told her to unleash a storm barrier to trap them. The golems weren't completely stopped, and Sistine apologized, but Glenn said it was enough and asked her to keep it going. He then began chanting a high-level incantation, unleashing a modified black magic spell called Extinction Ray, an attack powerful enough to erase the skeletal army and take out part of the school building in the process. Sistine never expected Glenn to pull off such a high-level spell, but right after that, Glenn suddenly collapsed and coughed up blood. He had pushed himself way too far, burning through all of his mana by forcing a spell that was well beyond his limits. Glenn tried to get Sistine to move somewhere safer, but suddenly Lake showed up, his sword magic already activated. Lake admitted that he had underestimated Glenn, who somehow managed to use the Extinction Ray despite being only a third-class mage. He also hadn't expected Glenn to have defeated Carol and Jin. Glenn asked Sistine if she was strong enough to neutralize Lake's sword magic with Dispel Force. Sistine honestly said there was no chance of that happening. Glenn then pushed her out of the way. Lake asked why Glenn wasn't running. He said he knew Glenn could use the Fool's World spell to cancel magic, but that technique didn't work once a spell was already active. Lake then sent his swords flying, and one of them managed to cut Glenn. If Glenn had been able to use Fool's World, those swords wouldn't have done a thing. Glenn tried to cast Red Lion, but Lake quickly disrupted it. Lake called Glenn slow and started casting Red Lion himself, but Glenn immediately countered with Savage Lightning Emperor and a Spear of Light aimed straight at him. Lake blocked with both swords. He figured it was safer to evade using his swords, because if he tried to continue with magic, Glenn would just nullify it and force him into a physical fight. On the other hand, if Lake stuck to sword combat, he risked taking a direct hit from Lightning Pierce. Lake was now curious about who Glenn really was. Glenn simply said he was just a substitute teacher. Lake didn't buy it. He then launched all four of his swords toward Glenn. Glenn tried to cast Dispel Force, but before he could finish, the swords pierced him. Lake realized Glenn was completely out of energy. Fortunately, Sistine had been quietly casting Dispel Force herself, restoring Glenn's strength. Grabbing one of the swords, Glenn dashed straight toward Lake. Lake tried to reactivate his sword magic, but Glenn was already right in front of him and drove the blade into his body. In that moment, Lake remembered hearing about a skilled mage killer working with a court mage course. Then he collapsed. Glenn hated having to do something so unpleasant, but he was relieved Sistine had understood what he was trying to do earlier. After Sistine had fallen, she realized she had only been a burden to him. But she also remembered his earlier question about neutralizing Lake's sword magic with Dispel Force, which told her that if Glenn had only been trying to help her escape, he wouldn't have asked that at all. After that, Glenn told her they needed to get moving. Sistine warned him he wasn't in any shape to fight, but he said there was no time to think about that.